again, and welcome to The Whole Life. I'm Grace Fielding.
And I'm Paul Woolley, and today we're talking about character and the US election. Hello, and welcome back. It's a year of general elections. The UK, the US, and India, the world's most populous nation, are just three of the countries set to hold elections in 2024. More than 2 billion people across 50 countries could head to the polls in the coming year, which is a record high. But politics seems more polarized, divisive, and broken than ever. In the United States, the Republican Party presidential primaries are underway. It looks at this point as if there's a serious prospect of either Presidents Biden or Trump winning in November. How is that possible? How has it come to this? Why is politics so destructive right now? Is it that by focusing on the right politics, we've lost sight of character? Well, that's the contention of Michael Weir in his new book, The Spirit of Our Politics. In it, he argues that we cannot separate out the kind of politics we have, our laws, our political leaders and institutions, our culture, from the kind of people we are.
Yes, that's right. Michael is president and CEO of the Washington based Center for Christianity and Public Life. For over a decade, he served as an advisor for a range of civic leaders on matters of faith and public life, including as a staffer in the Obama White House. Michael, hello. Welcome to The Whole Life.
Hello, it's so good to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's so good to have you with us.
Michael, it's great to see you again. Let's start
Yes.
with you, Michael. Why did you get involved with politics? How did you start that journey? What did that look like?
Yeah, so I was interested in civics from a very young age. I think it came from my grandfather. My grandfather served in World War II, came back, was not a political person, but was very involved in the community, and that rubbed off on me. I became a Christian when I was 15. I was handed a tract of Romans, and it changed my life. And my almost immediate reaction was, well, now I need to go to seminary, become a pastor, because I just, you just want to do the most Christian thing that you could think of. And thankfully, uh, I had a pastor in my life who said, Michael, there are Christians who aren't pastors. And I thought that is a keen observation. And so uh, early in my life, this vocational question of what does it mean to be faithful in and with public things was something I formed, I could articulate, and it's been uh, a central pursuit of my life, failingly and with a lot of, but it's been a guiding question for me that led me to DC. And uh, what I came to discover and what I grew in is understanding politics as an essential, not the only, not the most important, but politics as an essential forum in which we can love our neighbor. That because we have political responsibility, it falls under the calling of our lives as Christians to put all that we have say over under the jurisdiction of love of God and love of neighbor. And politics is a part of that. And so that's guided my professional work, and it's at the heart of this book.
That's so interesting. I mean, you're like Wilberforce, aren't you? I mean, Wilberforce, he has a conversion experience, and then he thinks I need to quit politics and
Yes.
get ordained. And then, of course, it's John Newton. We were talking about this in an earlier episode, who persuades him to remain in politics and
Yes.
champion the common good, love of God and neighbor from within the political scene. I've got my background similar, I guess, to yours, Michael, in terms of I did theology. And then my first job was working in Parliament. And for me, there was a logic to the idea that if I'm serious about loving God and loving my neighbor as myself, it makes sense to be involved in the institutions that impact the lives of my neighbors, especially those who are most vulnerable.
Yes.
Tell us, Michael. So you have this sort of conversion experience. You have this commitment to public life. and seeking to do that well. What did you do? Who did you work for, and what did that look
Yeah.
like?
Yeah, sure. So I through a providential occurrence that, as many providential occurrences, you know, uh happened to be the case, also involved my own stupidity. I was supposed to be leading a group to an event at a hotel in Washington. I show up at the hotel. It's empty, but I never attended a political anything before a convention, to be sure. So I just am walking around this hotel expecting I'll come upon the room where this event is taking place. And at one point I asked a receptionist, where is this thing? And she goes, "Oh, honey, it's not for another couple days. I just had the complete wrong date." And on my way out of the hotel, I'm embarrassed and feeling dejected. Um, and a young senator by the name of Barack Obama is walking into the hotel from meetings the day or two before
Wow.
the event that I was supposed to be leading a group of students to. And he hadn't formally announced his presidential campaign at that point. There was no Secret Service. He basically walked up to me, and I ended up working in the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships for 3.5 years, working exactly as you said, Paul, working to help connect um, government and public programs to faith-based groups and others who were serving those in need on the ground, and also helping the president navigate the range of religious issues and religious relationships that are part of serving and governing a country. And so I did that for 3.5 years, and um, served as a consultant before we founded the Center for Christianity and Public Life last year.
Now, so tell us, Michael. I guess for me, Barack Obama first enters my consciousness when he gives. I think he's basically proposing. It might have been Al Gore to be the candidate at a Democrat convention. Is that right? He gives this
John
speech.
Kerry,
Oh, it's John Kerry.
2004.
Yeah. Oh, well done.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, and that it was around basically the politics of hope,
yeah,
I think, if I remember rightly. And
yeah.
it was one of those speeches that if you were into politics in the UK scene, whether you were on the sort of the right or the left, suddenly this personality emerges and everyone thinks, goodness me, he is good. So tell us, presumably you'd kind of registered that too. But tell us, what were some of the highlights of working in the White House and working for President Obama particularly?
Yeah, so in that 2004 speech, he uh it's full of both not just Christian allusions, but direct, he says we worship an awesome God in the blue states, too, as part of this riff he has, saying that we're not all that different. That polarization is telling us a story about ourselves that's not quite true, not quite as clear cut as polarization suggests. Um, but then he also gave a speech in 2006 in which he argued that it was a practical absurdity for the secular left to to ask people of faith to leave their faith outside the door of our politics. And I had just become a Christian a few years earlier, and I'd become a Christian in an environment. There's all this conversation in the States now about Christian nationalism and what Christians are doing in our politics. This is all basically a redux of the conversation that was happening in the middle of the Bush years. And so, for those who can recall 2004, 2005, this is little is new about the current conversation. Um, and so I came to faith, not just wrestling with theology, but with this idea of um, what does it mean for what I think about pluralism? What does it mean for what I think about people who aren't Christian in our politics, in our public life, if I myself become a Christian, and in my case, an evangelical Christian? And for Barack Obama to speak into that moment speak directly to his own party that was, I think, promoting some unhelpful ideas, and to say no, that it's practically absurd to ask people of faith to somehow, as if they could, separate out their faith, but what they believe in God and what they believe to be true about religion from what they believe to be true and what they believe to be actionable in politics. That was deeply moving to me, and so that was a big part of why I ended up working with him. We were able to work together. I was involved in his national prayer breakfast speeches. We were involved in I had the honor of working with the president on adoption and foster care policy in the states, combating human trafficking. But the faith-based office in the White House is a part of the Domestic Policy Council, and so it speaks into the whole range of domestic and actually a range of international issues as well: global health, international religious freedom. And so we were able to play a part in a number of different policy roles. Here's one thing I'd say, Paul, on grace, which is I think people often expect, oh, you went to DC or you went to London, and Paul, I don't know if your experience was like this. You saw how the sausage was made. You must be really cynical. Uh, and I have to say, I left the White House. My role every day, I was working with sincere people, Christians and others, who had oriented their lives around serving those in need. I've never been as prayed for as those years when I was in the White House. I saw, yes, everywhere in life, you meet leaders who aren't what they say they are. I also met leaders and volunteers and all kinds of people who had such integrity that they blessed those that they came across. And so I left the White House. Yes, I think having a more informed view of some of the problems in our politics, public life, and the life of the church, but feeling, gosh, there are resources here. Good is being done. And this is an area of life in which Christians, yes, there are challenges to faithfulness in politics like any other area of life. And that's why I so love the work of LICC, because you don't shy away from that. But we're called to faithfulness, and it's something that's possible. It holds up in the areas of life in which we find ourselves, including politics.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that was my experience too. I think perhaps since not working in politics and in more recent years, might have had some other questions about just the health of our politics and what's going on. But certainly
Yeah.
at the time, I think the people that I was surrounded with, and I would say the majority of those in political life, are motivated by concern for the good, for the common
Yes.
good, even if they have disagreements about how to bring that about.
Yeah.
It's in more recent years, perhaps, that the political context has become that much more polarized. I'm really interested, Michael, in the fact that you came to politics before really you came to Christianity, but
Yeah.
I'm assuming that your Christianity and the Christian story then has helped frame your understanding of the role of politics and the role of the
Yes.
state and how that works vis-a-vis civil society and other institutions in seeking to promote the common good. But let's come on to this question about character, because
Yeah.
I'd be interested to know what you see as the connection between the Christian story and then the significance of character in leaders generally, but our political leaders in particular.
Yes. T.S. Eliot has this quote. He says, "The human endeavor has been to try to create a system so perfect that people no longer have to be good." And that, to me, strikes at so much of the conceit at the heart of so much of what we have taken politics to be, which is this sort of way to technique our way around the kind of people we are. And I think the Christian story, and I just think reality, and I think the Christian story is reality. like I think reality shows us there is no getting around the kind of people we are. There are mitigation techniques, and so much of our laws and constitutions, that's what they amount to, these mitigation techniques. But that's really what they amount to. um, I think structures and public policy are incredibly important, and I think that they could incentivize uh, uh, good formation. They can incentivize public service that's oriented toward the good as opposed to self-aggrandizement. But the conviction I've had after seeing and experiencing and being a part of, and still being a part of, how public policy is made, how politics works, is that politics is responsive at the end of the day, in a democratic society, though imperfectly, uh, to the people that make up that democracy. That is the beauty of democracy. It's the weakness of democracy. The state of our politics is a reflection at the end of the day of the state of our souls. And if we want good policy, if we want good politicians, those are going to have to emerge from a people who are capable not just of wish casting or having the right answers about what they want politicians to do, but people who are the kind of people who would actually will that and can intend that. I think a great example of this is, you pull the question of, in the American context, I don't know if it's the same in the UK context, you ask people directly, you know, do you like negative advertising or would you want more positive advertising? And people know the right answer to give there generally. Yes, I wish our politics was more about positive solutions for the people. But Paul, as you know, you the ad makers, you run policy ads, and it turns out the people generally don't respond to them that well. You run ads that are about attacking the opponent's character, or inspiring rather than hope and aspiration and compassion, inspiring fear and anger and contempt and condemnation. And unfortunately, many people will choose the fear and respond to the fear and the anger. And for some reason, the constructive policy solutions aren't what actually their heart is desiring. And so you end up in, yes, our politicians have a special responsibility because of the roles that they have of sometimes, of trying to resist the incentive structure that our system provides. But gosh, that is not a long-term solution, as we've seen. Uh, uh, yes, there are moments of courage when you could say no to what the people seem to be asking of you. You say no too many times, and we live in a democratic society where they can vote you out. And so we've seen a number of figures in American politics who have said things. One of the examples I use in the book is, during the 2008 presidential campaign in America, um, uh, John McCain, who ran against Barack Obama, was at a town hall, and this was in the closing weeks of the campaign.
Yeah, I remember this actually.
And a woman steps
Yeah.
up at this town hall and says, I'm afraid of what's going to happen to our country if Barack Obama becomes president, and mention all these sort of epithets and these fears that she had. And John McCain says, look, I'm running for president because I think I'd be a better president than Barack Obama. But I want to tell you, you don't have to be afraid of Barack Obama. And the crowd boos.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we just have to ask, well, and these are difficult questions. What is it? What are the needs that are being met? What are the needs that are not being met in from other sources, including, uh, 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 what is it about people that would make them boo someone telling them they don't have to be afraid? Like that's a question to sit with and ponder. There are other examples of this, in different settings. Just very quickly, I remember George W. Bush after he left office, going to Saddleback Church, Rick Warren's church. And George W. Bush was asked, it was for his book Decision Points, and he's reflecting very soberly on some of the decisions he made with military action. And he's really rigorously going through the tension he felt, but he resolves it by saying, like, at the end of the day, I feel like I made the right decision. And you could feel this tension that had been built up in the audience release, and they start clapping like it was a rally, even though Bush is very sober. And the president of the United States, the commander-in-chief, actually, the former commander-in-chief, actually had to say to the audience, no, that's not what I'm doing here. Basically, that was not my intention. This is not a fireworks moment. I'm as sober about my conviction that it was the right decision as I was sober about the tensions that I feel were inherent in making that decision. But what about it? Just what about the spirit in that church led people to want to respond to that moment with that release of tension, as opposed to holding that tension and actually affirming the tension inherent in something like a decision to go to war?
Yeah, amazing. Just quickly, Michael,
Yes.
a couple of things, and then just a quick question. So the couple of things are, one is, I mean, I think you're reminding us that the human heart is deceitful, and
Yes.
we pretend that we have certain values and drives and are people of certain character, but often our practice and our what we do doesn't reflect, what we state we are. Secondly, it's just so interesting, isn't it? The way you've been talking, I kind of look back to the time, particularly when President Bush was in office. That seemed such a polarized time. That seems nothing compared with now. I mean, that seems he is the absolute
Yes.
statesman, and in fact, his
Yes.
life since he's been president. I mean, I think he's massively respected. But
Yes.
just getting into this connection between character and the Christian story.
Yes.
Where do you see the connection there in terms of the way the Christian story may or may not talk about the significance of character in leaders, and then political leaders especially? What would you say, just briefly, on that?
Yes. It's all over. You can look to the prophet Jeremiah. You can look to Esther. You can look to Daniel. In the New Testament, and Paul, you know this about me, I'm deeply influenced by the work of Dallas Willard. Dallas Willard has shot through this book. The principal concern of Jesus, I am convinced, is in the kind of person, the kind of people we are becoming. And so you look at something like how Jesus talks about cleaning the inside of the cup. And in the process of cleaning the inside of the cup, you will be getting to the outside of the cup. But if you just attend to the outside of the cup, because that's where the presentation is, that's where the performance is, you will leave the inside of the cup untouched. And that, to me, there are many parables and teachings of Jesus which speak to this very question. But if I had to point to one, that is the one public leaders in particular should be thinking about, but also uh, individual citizens and people who have to think about not just politics but their public life in general, how they are at work, how they are on social media. There is something profound about going beyond the righteousness of the Pharisees and the scribes, that if we don't understand, we will be missing out on the kind of life that Jesus offers. Just one more very quick thing, which is what I don't want people to hear with this, and I know people come from various backgrounds and traditions. When we talk about character, when we talk about formation, it's very important that we don't have a vision and imagination of a God who is looming over us, waiting for us to fail, waiting for us to screw. Life with Jesus is and is an opportunity. Uh, Jesus has said his yoke is easy, his burden is light. It's non-existent. There's a burden, but what Jesus is saying is that life outside of his yoke is a much more heavy load to bear than life in it. And so I just want to relieve people of this. When we talk about formation, when we talk about character, sometimes people say, well, I must be such a disappointment to God. And I just want you to know that you're not a disappointment to God. God is deeply invested in the person you're becoming, and he sees the person you're becoming, and he delights in you as you are now.
I love that,
And it's
Michael.
just very important to make sure that we aren't abusing ourselves with these misguided notions of who God is. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's so helpful. And I think sometimes, yeah, or sort of at LICC, we talk a lot about, discipleship. And actually, if we're not careful, it can become this sort of this task that we have for ourselves. And actually, that's missing the point altogether, isn't it? Because it's Jesus doing that work in us. And actually, as you
Yeah.
say, he is kind and compassionate, and he's more committed to our discipleship than we ever will be.
Yes.
That's really helpful, what you shared. You mentioned earlier, Michael, a bit about the sort of the current discussion within the states around, I think, especially things like Christian nationalism and how that can be a challenge, to say the least. But I think it probably is fair to say that the link between faith and politics in the US, as well as in some ways in the UK, is complex. So on the one hand, you have the US as the first explicitly secular government in history, where there's that really clear separation between church and state. But then on the other hand, God, we might even put God in inverted commas, plays a really major role in US
Yes.
politics. And I suppose, both, if we think about Biden and Trump, both explicitly have religious reference to faith that we hear often. But that also to us might seem divisive rather than, I'm sure, as Christians, what we would hope to be unifying. Big question coming at you now. How have we got to this?
Yeah. So it is a big question. So I'll just offer a few thoughts,
Yeah,
but
great.
I'd say especially in the first half of
Sure.
the spirit of our politics, I really sort of unpack quite a bit of this. The first thing I'd say is there's this idea of the disappearance of moral knowledge, which is essentially this idea that in the post-World War II era, gatekeepers of knowledge, and this is all Willard stuff, gatekeepers of knowledge acted as if decided that religious or moral knowledge was not publicly available knowledge, was not fit for public teaching. Now, one of the problems with this is that we live in a moral universe. And in politics, for instance, we have to make moral decisions whether we want to acknowledge that we need moral knowledge to make them, and that we're operating off of some assumptions that imply at least moral knowledge, whether we like it or not. And so what we've done, Willard thought, and I think the separation of church and state can be, and in the American context, should be zealously upheld, he wrote. But what I worry about is the philosophical work that the separation of church and state does, which is separate from the legal work. And I think it doesn't necessarily have to follow, but it suggests this idea that the resources of the Christian faith are just not up to the task of real life.
Yeah.
And you all spend such time unpacking this sort of modern presumption that I think is a death knell to discipleship if we embrace it. I just wanted the other thing I'd say is just on this Christian nationalism idea. There are a number of terms, Christian nationalism, post-Christian, that I actually think we need to be very careful about embracing, and the assumptions that are sort of embedded in them. I am very hesitant to refer to a movement that is supposedly indebted to, beholden to a man who would stand up at our national prayer breakfast after someone gives a talk on Jesus's teaching about loving your enemies and essentially say, uh, uh, I'm not sure I buy that. You're going to get steamrolled if you try that love your enemies stuff. Try that in your personal life, but in politics, that's not going to work. And that's what Donald Trump did. And so I'm very hesitant. I get the academic conversation, all of that. We need to be very we need to be careful about applying the adjective Christian to something that so blatantly runs counter to basic Christian teachings beyond sort of political application. I mean, if you're going to say I've never had to offer forgiveness, well, that's not. I'm going to be hesitant about applying that label to you, and the same thing applies to post-Christian. I think I want to contest this idea and what we're actually conveying to the public when we suggest we're in a post-Christian era through the work of LICC, through the work that volunteers are doing, through the life of the church that's under the administration of faithful pastors. Uh, uh, those areas aren't post-Christian, and so yeah, I think that would be the other thing I'd say to this conversation of how we got here. A lot of it is conceding things that we should have never conceded.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. You mentioned just then Donald Trump, so I wonder if we might talk about Trump briefly. It's sort of extraordinary, Paul mentioned at the moment at the start, to think that the likely Republican candidate to be president will be somebody of the character that we've seen of Donald Trump. Why do you think that is, that we're in that place?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's I'll give a sort of political and practical answer, and then I'll give a answer that relates more directly to our conversation, though I think both are relevant. The first is Donald Trump was someone who was extolled in American culture for decades outside of politics explicitly as a model of American success,
Mm.
of someone who knew how to get things done. He was in Americans' living room for over a decade with a presentation of being decisive and always knowing the right thing to do and having stakes and ties and things to his name. He was a model of what you were supposed to be in America. Now, that says a lot about the popular culture, which
Yeah.
would extol that as the model of the good life. Um, but then when that gets imported into politics, I think there's enough cynicism about politicians, enough distrust in political institutions generally, that is a significant role in Trump's political success. I think the good news for many is I think that we've gone a bit overboard in suggesting that Trump's political success is some uh, is the result of some grand ideological commitment that people are making.
Mm.
I think people's politics are pretty fluid, and I think look the uh, the vast majority of people who voted for Donald Trump voted for Mitt Romney, voted for John McCain, voted for George W. Bush, with the exceptions there for life and turnover, sort of demographically. But like we need to be careful about thinking. 80 million Americans are thinking as much about politics and public policy as people who are on cable news and for
Mm.
whom it's their job. The second thing I'd say is to something Paul said in the opening, which is I think there was a view popular in America that holds today, um, particularly among conservative Christians. And we actually have a someone who is a leading theologian and runs one of the largest runs the largest seminary in America, who said that prior to 2016, he did not have to commit an ounce of moral energy to his decision about who to vote for. What that is a reflection of is this idea that our Christian politics, what it means to have a Christian politics is to have the right answer on a couple of issues, and that makes things very clear. And one party has the right answer on these couple of issues, the other party doesn't. And so the Christian way to vote is straightforward. It doesn't require an ounce of moral energy. That was wrong then. What happened was Donald Trump comes in with the right answers on those questions, quote unquote, the right answers on those questions, but won't even play to some of the respectability politics that had usually accompanied those positions. And the people who had made the arguments election after election, vote on this issue, vote on this issue, all of a sudden we're telling people who had been catechized in that way that that's what a Christian politics meant. Oh, not in this case, not in this scenario. For some reason, and they really couldn't explain it, because it would mean that they'd have to reject not just what they were saying in 2016, but they'd have to reject the limited guidance that they had given in previous elections. Um, they didn't, they weren't able to shift people's framework for thinking about what it means to participate in politics in a Christian way, which is not. I just want to be clear, and folks who look at the book will. The answer is not, oh, everyone should have been voting for the other party. That's not it. It's that, in the same way that we don't have a faith that is just about the distillation of a few good answers or right answers, a Christian politics is about much more uh, about having the quote unquote right policy answers on two or three issues. Um, and we've talked about what it is about a bit in this on this podcast already, but it's also the subject of the book.
Yeah, maybe we could give people a little sneak peek of what they
Yeah.
might be able to unpack more of. So, in your book, you offer so refreshingly the sort of argument that we need a distinctly Christian approach, which I think is sort of some of what you've just been saying, whether
Yeah.
that's to do with how we vote or also how we just view politics as a whole. That results in sort of healing rather than division, kindness rather than hatred, and hope rather than despair, which I just think sounds incredible. And the question is, how do we do that? How, as Christians, do we put those amazing ideas into practice? Obviously, we don't want to give away all of your book, but
No.
a few thoughts.
Yeah. So first, we must have a vision of our life in God's kingdom that then informs our vision of our politics. That we don't just think as a nice thought, but that we actually we actually intend to organize our lives in a way that we might be increasingly placing our lives under that vision and within the stream of that vision. And once we have the vision and we're able to make the proactive intention that this is the kind of person I want to become, there are means that we can take up to do that. And so in the book, I offer a range of practices, both sort of traditional spiritual disciplines. So, for instance, I think in this culture that we have today, not just political, but the media culture that we have, the disciplines of silence and solitude are just increasingly precious for uh, for for us to be able to make sure that we're not taking the marching orders of our culture and that we're not falling into absorbing the logic of our politics, but we're actually bringing the logic of the gospel to our politics.
Sure.
And what that takes are these periods of reminding ourselves that we are more than just an amalgamation, the sum of inputs and pressures and influences that our media and politics and technology has to offer. And then I offer 21st century disciplines that public disciplines, like the guidance around news consumption, um, the the practice of affirming those that you oppose politically where it's right and just, and critiquing those that you generally support politically where it's right and just. And so I think these practices are a huge part of, again, placing our political activity as a part of our life in and with Jesus. But then I also think, and I've seen this up close, we should not underestimate yes, it's imperfect the way that individuals are able to sort of influence our politics. There are structural issues which direct our politics in certain ways. But at the base level, if we provide different incentives to our politics will adapt to those incentives. And so, for instance, if we are the kind of people who will resist the lies of polarization that suggests that mere political difference is to be ultimatized into good and evil, then our politicians will be less likely to feed that story to us, because we're giving them resistance when they try to do so. And so yeah, that's a snapshot, but really the book is about this problem, and that's what I lay out.
So helpful, and I think so needed. I think so often Christians can feel so bewildered of how do
Yes.
we engage with politics. So actually, yeah, I think it's so helpful just even hearing some of those suggestions of how we can practice things ourselves, as you say, things like silent solitude, but then also how that then affects, I suppose, our own political action.
Yes.
Perhaps we've spoken about the Christian story and how that relates to politics, and I think it'd be fair to say that the God of US politics can sometimes seem very different from the God that we know of the Christian story. But what would you say is the connection between the person of Jesus that I know you spoke about earlier, and some of how the character of Jesus, is kind of important in what makes a good leader? So yeah, what's this connection between Jesus and political involvement, and then how can Christian leaders, in I suppose whatever sector or field they find themselves in, grow in this personal formation and this kind of discipleship that we've again touched on already?
Yeah, Grace, it's a very deep question.
We like deep questions on this podcast,
yeah.
Michael.
Too right.
Willard defines joy as a pervasive and constant sense of well-being.
I love that.
And at my events over the last a number of years, I've asked audiences, how many of you would define our politics as full of a pervasive and constant sense of well-being?
Good question.
And it's a laugh line.
Yeah.
It's a laugh line. But we truly need to ask ourselves why that is, and why Christians find it acceptable there, like natural there, like yeah, it's ludicrous to think that we might have a pervasive and constant sense of well-being in our political involvement, in a way that we never explicitly say that about our, like, yes, the ideal state with our relationship to our finances should be anxiety, fear, self-aggrandizement. But for some reason, and again, it was sort of, I think there are reasons that we could name politics is just an area, but Jesus, if we take him seriously enough, that when he says he has a life to offer us, when he says, take heart, in this world you will have trouble, but I have overcome the world. If we take him seriously, then we could take that spirit with us into politics. I am convinced that there are, yes, I think Christian resources can offer a great deal of, I think Christians have a role in speaking into what our politics is and what policy should be. I think in this climate, one of the greatest gifts that we could offer to our politics is a reminder to our politics of what it is not, what it is not equipped to do, the fact that it is penultimate. But that requires being able to look and see the world as Jesus sees it. What Willard called a God-breathed world. And we just have to, as Christians at the end of the day, and C.S. Lewis talks about this in Mere Christianity. He says very quickly, we think we're having political conversations. And we say we're going to go into politics. We're led to politics because we want to love our neighbor. But Lewis says very quickly we realize, well, you don't know how to love your neighbor unless you love God. And so Lewis says this thing happens where very quickly we're turned back upon religious questions. We're turned back upon these questions of the kind of people we are, even as we were trying to ask these quote unquote practical questions. We come to realize that with Jesus, the spiritual is the practical.
Yeah. Michael, that's so interesting, and I agree with you. I mean, I think in our own context, we need to remind ourselves and remind politicians that politics is really important, but it is not all important. And politics and the state is limited in what it can do, but it can do certain things that are really important, and it needs to do those things. But I mean, I know this is really shocking to us. Obviously, Michael, not all of us are politically wired. We're not all political animals. And what about those of us outside of politics? What are the implications of this for just our everyday lives and work? This character thing, what would you say?
Yes. So one way to just sort of speak to this is at the end of the chapter in which I offer these sort of practices or disciplines, I had a friend who was reading and giving me a response to this chapter, and they said, these are all sort of individual option, but what would it look like to actually live this out? And so the friend was Laura, and so I said, well, I'm sorry, but you've written yourself into the book. I created a composite character. The title of the closing section in this chapter is a week in the life of Laura, and I just sort of walk through a reasonable what it might look like in the life of a person who has other responsibilities, other affections, what it might look like for them to view politics. They're limited. So the idea is this person is not someone whose work involves politics. This is not someone whose vocation is political, but because they're a citizen or because they have been given political responsibility, politics falls within the range of their effective will. And so that's one way to answer the question. The other way I'd answered this question is, and I think this might be also what you're getting at, what I'm trying to do in this book, or one of the things I'm trying to do, is extend the faith and work conversation into the public life and political sort of setting. And I believe the faith and work conversation was an attempt to extend the discipleship conversation into the work setting, because it was very clear that for all the general teaching that was happening in our churches about, say, the fruit of the Spirit, we were hearing from so many Christians who, if you ask them, what does God have to do with your work, they didn't know. And it wasn't, in some ways, like, it wasn't their fault. We expected people to, um, I think, especially in evangelical traditions, we sometimes uh, uh, have too high esteem in our own teaching and forget that catechesis is about more than just teaching general principles. And so, look, character is for all of life. Spiritual formation, um, which is the formation of your character, is not something you choose to have happen. There are not spiritual people, though we use that terminology. We Our spirits, our characters, our wills are all being formed. And the question is, what kind of participation are we going to have in that process? And that will affect all of our life. Our relationships, our work, our politics. But what I try to argue in the book is that formation doesn't work in such a way that you can quarantine off parts of your life and say, well, I don't think God wants this part formed, or it's not practical to pursue formation here, and keep that quarantined off from the whole person. This podcast is called the Whole Life Podcast. It's not, I don't think there's any other way to do discipleship. It's not just that whole life discipleship is some ideal. It's that actually, if there are parts of your life that you say, no, you can't have this, Jesus, then the whole project, so to speak, of discipleship is undercut at the outset. I've come to believe, because I think the same kind of logic that people use to say, well, following Jesus in politics is really impractical, when the pressure is on in other areas of their life, they'll think it's impractical as well.
I agree. Although I just like to completely disagree with myself. I realized when I was asking you that question, in that I think we are all political animals, in the sense that we cannot disassociate ourselves, particularly within a liberal democracy, from politics. And I think you're challenging all of us, Michael, whoever we are, wherever we are, whatever our political context is, to navigate political strife, or indeed the culture wars, in our neighborhoods, our workplaces, and churches. So in a sense, you are leaving us with that challenge that we have a responsibility in an environment that is so contested, is so polarized, is so divided, to nonetheless try and be agents of redemption in that environment. Just very quickly, one thought on how we could do that. What would your advice be? If I want to be a redemptive agent of change in the context of strife, what should I attend to?
Christians do not go to politics to get their spiritual needs met. Their spiritual and emotional needs are met elsewhere. That is possible for us. And because of that, it's possible for us to go to politics in an other-centered way, not completely neglecting ourselves and our self-interest. I think it's important to be explicit about what that is, or else it's very hard to be other-centered if you don't know where yourself is in the situation. But it frees us up to go to politics, not as entertainment, not as what the political scientist Eitan Hirsch calls as political hobbyists, but actually approaching politics as the limited but essential area of life in which we participate in self-government, in which we participate in decisions, not with ultimate influence, like in so many other areas of our life, we are not accountable for the outcomes of our political process. Just like we're not responsible for the outcomes of the work we're doing. We're responsible for faithfulness in the midst of those things,
Right.
and we could leave the outcomes to the Lord. And so that's, we are freed up by Christian resources to enter into politics in a way that's other-centered. What that means very practically is, what issue, what area of need in your community has political implications that the Lord has already placed on your heart. Well, I think there's an idea, and I tell a story in the book about a parent who came to me, was concerned that his son was getting too too involved in politics. They were watching a Twitch stream, which is you watch people play video games online, but this particular Twitch stream, the person would provide political commentary, and pretty incendiary political commentary. And so I think the parents' initial impulse was, I see what politics is doing to my child. How can I get them away from this? But so often I think the right move is to say, no, it's not necessarily politics that has a grip. It's political entertainment. And it's actually the political entertainment that your son is consuming actually distances themselves from the real work of politics. So one of the best things that you could do is actually put them in positions where they need to see how their political ideas and all these notions that they have actually work in the context of a school board or a city council, and actually trying to get things done. And then all of a sudden they'll realize, oh gosh, I didn't think I had this great idea about housing policy or about how schools should be funded. But I raised this idea, and I come to learn that there's this whole other constituency that has an interest that's not necessarily malicious, but that has bearing on this solution that I thought was so easy. And then all of a sudden you start to realize, oh gosh, this isn't necessarily about good and evil necessarily. This isn't necessarily about me knowing the right thing to do and those bums in Washington or those bums in London just being unwilling to act. No, actually, a lot of our public and public policy problems have to do because we're choosing between an array of imperfect options that have a whole array of various. And so actually, one of the ways to ward off political idolatry is to actually participate in politics, as opposed to only going to politics when it grabs your attention or when it raises your eyebrow a bit. So yeah.
No, that's brilliant. Michael, we could go on, but you've been so generous with your time. And yeah, you've given us such a real insight into not only the US context of politics, but also hope. I feel like today's been a really hopeful conversation. As we said, your book, The Spirit of Our Politics, is available online if people want to check it out. And maybe finally, what are you working on just now at the Center for Christianity and Public Life, in case people want to track with what you're doing there?
Yes, really appreciate it. We just announced our 2024 class of Public Life Fellows, and the Public Life Fellowship is a wonderful program for established Christian civic leaders in various streams of public life. So journalists, government folks in government, ministry leaders. And so we're really excited about that program. And then we'll be holding our second summit this fall. We'll be announcing the date soon, but we were really pleased to have folks take the flight across the Atlantic to join us, and that'll be a key moment for our organization. People can learn more about the Center for Christianity and Public Life at ccpubliclife.org.
Brilliant. ccpubliclife.org. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Michael. It's been amazing to chat to you. And again, thank you so much for putting aside this time today. It's so kind of you.
It really has. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you both. I am so grateful for the work you do. I've been so blessed by it through the years, and thank you for the example and the ministry that you all have.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, Paul, what a great conversation. What did you think?
It was a great conversation, wasn't it? And I think on the basis of what Michael said at the end, we definitely want him back. I mean, we could
I
do
know
every
he was a
episode.
great plug for us,
He
wasn't
was
he?
great, wasn't he? Amazing advertising. I thought Michael's thoughtful and as expected, and I thought increasingly thoughtful as the conversation went on. I thought there were a number of things that I was really struck by. I mean, firstly, this idea that he didn't quite say this, but I think this is what he meant, that we get the leaders we deserve. That are we can point the finger at what's wrong with our political culture, but so often we're complicit with that. So we talk about not appreciating negative advertising, but actually we are as gullible as the next person when it comes to it, and that seems to work. So I thought that was interesting. I thought there was potentially their advice for us around the sort of ongoing culture wars, in the sense that if we were as focused on having the right character as it were, the right, inverted commas, position on particular issues, I mean, that would at least change the atmosphere of the kind of discussions that we have. So I thought that was really helpful. I thought also that, it's helpful for us in a UK context to hear what Michael's saying, recognizing that there are parallels in our own context, and therefore we need to avoid being judgmental of the United States. I think there can be a kind of anti-Americanism that can so easily slip into the culture of Europe and our own culture. But in actual fact, we have, a lot of the kind of the issues, the challenges that Michael was describing. I suppose one thought to put to you, Grace, is that if I think about American politics, and the disclaimer here is I'm really interested in American politics. So, for me, kind of, growing up, the West Wing was, that was where it was at, and
Ideal view.
yeah, it was great. I never wanted to be president. Always wanted to be Leo, the chief of staff. But anyway, who basically I always thought was basically.
I was going to say you're not quite far off chief of staff, not here, but probably not in quite the same way as the West Wing.
No. I mean, if only that was true, Grace. But I would look back and say, well, one of the presidents that really stands out in terms of character was President Carter. So Jimmy Carter, I think Democrats, Republicans would say he was and remains someone of good character, and that he wasn't two-faced. That he was the same person in office as he was out of office, and there was and is an integrity and authenticity to him. At the same time, he would be generally considered as being unsuccessful as a political operator.
Yeah.
He only served one term, and various things happened during that term, and he was massively kind of lost against Reagan. So I think it's interesting, isn't it? We, being someone of good character does not necessarily mean then that you're quote unquote a political success. But I think what Michael did in this conversation was perhaps help us to kind of reframe, redefine what success looks like, and also challenge us to seek something better, to strive after it. So they were some of my thoughts. What about you, Grace? What did you think? What did particularly stand out for you?
Yeah, I think one of the things quite early on in the conversation that reminded me of another episode that we did with Luke Bretherton was just when Michael spoke about this whole idea of, politics being a way of us, and again, this is probably me paraphrasing, but being able to love our neighbour. And I just thought that was a lot of what Luke unpacked, wasn't it? He was sort of speaking about probably less of the kind of politics in terms of kind of party politics, but then more of that kind of like that neighborhood level. And so I suppose that was one thought, that it was just interesting that obviously, two people on the podcast with, lots of overlap, but actually that was one of the first things that Michael said was, it's a way for us as humans to love our neighbor. So that sort of struck me. And then the other thing, which I thought was very interesting at the very end of the conversation, which challenged me, as, I know you sort of asked this question, Paul, for those those who are listening who maybe are not political animals, or I thought
we know you are now, Grace.
I thought you were maybe putting that question in for me especially, but
no, not at all.
But it challenged me. When Michael sort of spoke about the story from his book about the parent who was worried about their son, and actually I think to an extent, unless we are self-confessed American political junkies like you, Paul, a lot of us can probably engage when things feel a bit exciting or maybe especially concerning, or it's almost like, it can become like politics can become something that we end up consuming or being kind of observers in. And actually, I think Michael's challenge to us was, rather than just kind of having an opinion or feeling like we want to speak up when it feels like the rest of the world is doing, actually what does that look like in our everydays on the places that in the places that God has put us. And I thought, some of those examples he gave were brilliant, whether that's the school board, or I was even just thinking about, I know after COVID lots of people have these WhatsApp groups for their roads and their streets.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah,
actually that's exactly. And that's an amazing forum for, you have no idea of who the people who are living in those homes, what sort of influence they have, and actually using our voice in that context for local issues. So I thought that was a really helpful challenge. And actually, as we sort of said at the end, I think there can be a tendency when we think about politics just to feel, well, quite frankly, deeply depressed. But I feel like actually, again, it was a conversation of hope and of a sort of alternative optimism, I suppose. And I think that that really came across from what Michael shared.
Yeah. Well, we'll count you in, Grace, to our election party. Both, obviously, we'll have two this year, one for the US election and one for the UK general election. So we'll make sure your name's down, and
Indeed.
look forward to
Lovely.
seeing
Can't
you there.
wait.
That would be great. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, shall we leave it there for today, Paul? We've had so
that's a
much
good
amazing
idea,
content
Grace.
from Michael, haven't we?
You can have too much fun, can't you?
Exactly. If you have enjoyed, and we hope that you have, this episode of The Whole Life, as usual, we'd love you to subscribe, leave us a review, and tell all your friends about it. But until next time, when we'll have another exciting episode for you from me, Grace, and my co-host, Paul Woolley, that was The Whole Life. Goodbye, and please do join us again soon.
Goodbye.